All right.
Yeah, John keeps claiming because as a retired professor, he can park anywhere on campus for free.
What?
Yes, a big perk. But he's like, we can only have our meetings at 9 or noon because there's never any parking in the middle of the day. And I'm like, no, you can't make that excuse anymore. Oh, cool.
Still not going through the, it's pretty loud. Whew. Shut up.
Is there not like a
No, usually it should go through HDMI and it's not, so it's fine. They can hear it in here, but it won't record on the lecture capture.
That's okay. It is what it is.
They won't be quizzed on it, I don't think.
Yeah. No, there are no bird song quizzes. Okay, it is 3:10, so I think we're going to get started. I have a couple announcements. The first is that your Habitat account, the first part of that assignment, is due tonight at midnight. That is different from the journals you do in lab on Mondays. Those will all be due together at the end of the quarter. So Habitat account is a separate assignment. It's due tonight at midnight. If you have questions about it, there's an assignment overview on Canvas, and my office hours are right after this lecture in Academic Surge, room 1353. So feel free to come to that if you have any questions. Also, there is no lab this coming Monday. It's a holiday. So we'll see you all back on Tuesday. I think that's all the announcements. All right. Now I get to introduce Dr. Brian Todd. He's a professor in our wildlife department here, and he has worked with a wide range of species and habitats and so on, but is primarily a herpetologist, so studying amphibians and reptiles. He also teaches a really excellent herpetology lecture class. His research, he's worked with a bunch of iconic California species, many of which are threatened or endangered, like mountain yellow-legged frogs and giant garter snakes.
And desert tortoises.
Desert tortoises. And has done a lot of really interesting work with like captive breeding programs, reintroduction, studying the effects of restoration efforts. So yeah, a wealth of knowledge. And today he's going to be talking to us about chaparral. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Todd.
Thanks. Remember the lesson of the turtle. You won't get anywhere in life if you don't stick your neck out. All right? So a few learning objectives. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to describe chaparral and coastal scrub habitats. We're going to cover our two habitats, but also identify where they're found in California. Identify common species that are associated with the habitats, ones that we'll talk about today. Describe some of the adaptations that these species have. And then distinguish between two different evolutionary processes, one called convergent evolution and one called divergent evolution. So we'll start with chaparral and coastal scrub, and shown here is a composite map of lots of different chaparral habitats and coastal scrub habitats, all highlighted in blue. But there is a slight distinction between the two of them. As the name implies, coastal scrub habitat is generally going to be found along the coast. It tends to be much lower growing and better adapted and suited to the moisture that comes in off of the coast in our maritime, heavily oceanic influenced coastal environments. It's a lot of low growing, drought deciduous shrubby vegetation. And by drought deciduous, what we mean is that it's losing its leaves. Many of the plants in coastal scrub habitat will lose their leaves during the drier times of the year. So not necessarily in winter in California, where we actually should be getting a lot of rain, but they'll actually lose it in the summer during droughts. Chaparral habitat, in contrast, is usually found more inland, sometimes just inland from the coastal scrub, but also all over the Sierra foothills and up into montane regions. Generally has more taller vegetation, so not just shrubs, but we're moving into trees. Many sclerophyllous plants, and that's a word most people are not familiar with. It just means hard leaves. Plants that have really rigid, hard leaves that help prevent or protect the plant from water loss. And then within the chaparral habitat in particular, there are a ton of different specific named chaparral habitats that all depend on latitude, where they are in the state, how far north or south, which affects their climate, how far up in elevation, which affects their climate, which side of the mountain they're on, exposure, and the plant species that will occur as a result. But we'll start with the coastal scrub habitat. It's kind of roughly divided into northern and southern communities. There is some difference in species composition with the plants and also with the wildlife. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, it's generally found along the coast, and we have a lot of oceanic fog. We tend to have a slightly more moist habitat and more moist climate close to the coast, but that only matters if the plants can harness that. It's not necessarily raining a lot more on the coast. A lot of that comes in as fog in the early mornings. It can do that even in June and July. And so plants often have these very fine, what look like hairs, but these very fine, delicate textures on their leaves that help cause the fog to condense and for water to pool up and drip down the sides of the plant into the soil where it can then use it through its roots. So that is an adaptation that many, not all, but many of the plants in coastal scrub habitat have to capture that fog moisture coming off of the ocean. And again, they're roughly sort of defined by where they are in the state, because the communities will differ, both plant and animal communities, wildlife communities, into northern and southern scrub habitat. Northern coastal scrub habitat, if you want to see an example, there's a lot of this kind of habitat still in protected areas near, for example, in Point Reyes National Seashore, as well as up along the coast into Mendocino. They're characterized by a lot of evergreen shrubs. So again, not a lot of trees in this coastal scrub habitat. That's a big contrast between much of the chaparral we'll get to later. And some herbs, so a lot of low-lying vegetation. Also, if you go to Point Reyes, you'll notice that much of that coastal scrub habitat is interspersed with big patches of grasslands. California's grasslands are often thought of or called coastal prairies. So you'll see these big swaths of grasslands interspersed with coastal scrub. In the southern region, we tend to have a slightly different type of scrub habitat that's characterized by a lot of aromatic shrubs, so really floral and fragrant plants. You'll still smell some of that in the northern scrub, but it's really prominent in the southern part of the state. And as a result, it's sometimes called the sage scrub habitat, because sage and true sages, as well as some of the false sages, plants that just smell like sage, are really abundant. This was a type of habitat that was really prominent in Los Angeles and San Diego well before we all started changing our landscape and denuding it all and replacing it with human-built infrastructure. And coastal scrub habitat, as well as chaparral habitat that we'll see, is home to a lot of endemic species, meaning they're found nowhere else on the entire planet except just in this kind of habitat in California. And as a result, again, because of what we've largely done to the habitat, many of those species have become endangered. Still sticking with the southern coastal scrub habitat, part of the reason it gets its name sage scrub, as I mentioned, is because things like the sagebrush, which is not a true sage, but also many of the true sages are found kind of unattractive, not necessarily standing out, but you'll know it when you smell it. If you were to go hiking in San Diego or LA in some of this area, and you were to snap off some of these twigs and smell them, you would really recognize that you're in the middle of this habitat. But a better way to know that you are really in pristine or valuable, high priority habitat for southern coastal scrub habitat is to find the next three species that I'm going to introduce. And these are wildlife species. The first of those is called the California gnatcatcher. It's been recognized as its own distinct species for 20 years or longer now, since around the 80s. It was formerly just thought of to be a part of a more widely distributed gnatcatcher complex, but now we know it is just a slightly different species, and it has an incredibly narrow distribution. Just Baja, Mexico, and up into extreme Southern California. It's been listed as a threatened species under our Federal Endangered Species Act. Its impairment driven largely by the loss of habitat or the fragmentation of remaining habitat because of urbanization, sprawl, the way we've built our infrastructure. Critical habitat was designated in 2007. And if you're not familiar with the Endangered Species Act, whenever you list a species as threatened or endangered, they are required to identify habitat that is critical for the survival of that species, to prevent its extinction and to help those populations recover. And they don't always do this at the same time that they list the species. Sometimes it takes a few years to identify that habitat. There may be other reasons they take their time. But you can see where a lot of this critical habitat has been declared, and it's kind of dispersed throughout parts of Southern California. But if you find a gnatcatcher, you're probably in good habitat for southern coastal scrub habitat. The orange-throated whiptail is another example of a species that you're only going to find in relatively intact coastal scrub habitat down in the San Diego region. It is just a subspecies of a more broadly distributed whiptail lizard, but it's notable and gets its common name of orange-throated because it develops these really bright patches. And it's mostly the males that do that. This is a way of males signaling to each other that they are defending a territory. It's advertising that, look, I'm really fit. I'm wearing something really bright, making myself noticeable, because if you want to fight, I'm ready to fight. And if you're a lady and you're ready to mate, I'm here for that too. And so this is intraspecific signaling. It's a way of communicating from one lizard to another. And it's mostly the males that get the really bright orange patches. Another endemic species, it's only found in Baja, Mexico, up into Southern California. And then likewise, we have a specific subspecies of the broadly distributed cactus wren, but it gets its name because it's only found in the San Diego area. So that subspecies epithet, sandiegensis, letting you know that it has a very, very small distribution compared to other closely related subspecies. So if you're out hiking and you hear this species and you hear a gnatcatcher, you happen to see an orange-throated whiptail, that would be what we call surrogate species. They're letting you know they're a surrogate, a stand-in for identifying high-quality remaining habitat. So that might be an area that if you're working for an environmental consulting firm and they're thinking about buying some land to set aside to protect this habitat, they may pay you to go out and try and find these species. Because if you do, they know that that's habitat they want to preserve. We'll pivot now and we'll talk about chaparral habitat, which is often found right up against coastal scrub habitat along the coast, but again is also distributed more inland and at higher elevations. Chaparral is really diverse. There is not just one type of chaparral. There are many. We're only going to talk about a handful. And the reason this habitat is so diverse and there are so many different kinds is because it's heavily shaped by the prevailing climate and where in the state it's found and even on what side of a mountain. As you can see in the photograph here, we have chaparral very clearly visible on the right side of this hilltop. And on the left side of the hilltop, it looks like we just have grass. Here in California, well, globally, let's remember the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. It also, in California, gets hotter in the afternoons, much hotter in the afternoons than it is in the mornings. So as a result, the sun is beating down on our landscapes with the greatest heat intensity in the afternoons. So areas that are on the west side of a hilltop or the west side of a mountain will tend to be a lot warmer because they're getting that afternoon sun. The only time they get sunlight on the east side is in the mornings when it tends to be cooler. And it's usually just not as hot. We also have winds that come in off the Pacific coast, which is to the west of our entire state. And so those winds will dry out the landscape. They will often pull a lot of moisture out of vegetation and pull a lot of moisture out of the soil. So the combination of being on the west side of a slope in California means you get hot afternoon sun and you get drying winds, which means it's going to be a lot harsher of a condition. Harsh conditions make for harsh habitats. One of the chaparral habitats that is really widespread is kind of a catch-all term. It's called mixed chaparral habitat. It's called mixed because it is a mix of a lot of different plant types, as many as 240 different woody plant species. Exactly which species depends on how close you are to Oregon or how far south you are in the state. But it is often incredibly dense and hard to walk through. If you're out hiking and you're able to hike through chaparral habitat, it's because someone put in a hiking road or a hiking path It might be because there's a road through it, or it might be a game trail that deer have created or other wildlife just by walking the same path over and over. Because it is really hard to just plow through this. If you ever go hunting and you've got dogs, even dogs have a hard time getting through this trying to find birds and other game. One of the common plants that we have in mixed chaparral is the toyon. You might recognize it as the California holly. Really prominent in the chaparral habitat around the Hollywood sign, from which presumably Hollywood gets its name. A tip-off about where to find montane chaparral is right in the name. Montane chaparral is found at higher elevations in the mountainous parts of California. When you're looking at this distribution map, you can see you'll find that along the upper elevations of the Sierra Mountains, as well as parts of the Coast Range and the Transverse Range down in the southern part of the state. Not as much of it in the northern Coast Range because the elevations don't get high enough to really support montane chaparral, which does a reasonable job of growing in cool weather and in the Sierra where there can be plenty of snow in the winter seasons. It can support a lot of really tall evergreen trees, things like pine trees and fir trees. But we also have very dense, firm hardwoods like manzanita. Many of you have seen this. This has a really dark red, smooth bark in most cases. And there's another one that I always forget that's found at lower elevation that looks just like it. Does anybody remember what the one is, that the other tree that, what? Madrone, yes. It always messes with me because they both begin with an M-A. But manzanita is a common one in montane chaparral at higher elevations. Madrone is something we tend to find at lower elevations and not as part of this chaparral habitat. And then if we're thinking about what kind of chaparral would be in the harshest conditions, the ones to the southwest, on the west side of a slope, getting the hot afternoon sun, getting the drying winds off of the coast, it's usually going to be chamise chaparral. This is much, much shorter in height, 1 to 2 meters. You can generally see over it, but it's still very dense and difficult to walk through, just like mixed chaparral can be, except you are less likely to get lost because at least you can see where you're going and where you're coming from. Chamise chaparral gets its name because chamise, like this plant, is called chamise. Tends to be really prevalent in this habitat. And what's interesting is I remember the first time I lectured and gave this lecture in this class several years ago. I'm from the East Coast. I had never really spent any time in California, traveled through the state once briefly. I came out here, started learning about it. They asked me to give this lecture, and I said, I don't know anything about these habitats, but I'll do my best to learn. And then after I talked about this, it's all I saw when I drove around California. So if you're driving through the Coast Range, if you're headed the back way on 128 over to Napa, you can tell where the ridge line is and which side's the west side and which side's the east side of every hillside in California, if you just keep in mind the difference in vegetation. So this harsh-facing west slope is always going to have that lower, drier vegetation, and that would be the chamise chaparral. And on the east side of this ridge line, you pick up the more mixed, higher, taller shrubs. All right, but we're a wildlife department, so let's move on to the wildlife and think about some of the critters that call these communities home. I don't know much about birds, except when you look up, keep your mouth closed. First day of class in herpetology, a couple of students came in with some bird stuff on them. I study reptiles and amphibians. Birds are a type of reptile, but that's not included in the way we think about reptiles these days. But we'll give you a few examples because they give us an opportunity to look at, in particular, convergent evolution. So this is a wren tit. And again, I tend not to think about birds much day to day. Sorry, I'm doing better about it. But one of the birds that really stands out to me is this one, because once you hear this call, you're going to start to hear it all around California when you're in chaparral habitat. It is the only New World, so in North and South America, the only example of a species that, the only species example from a family that's largely distributed in the Old World. It doesn't move around a whole lot. It's a small bird, and because it doesn't like to be out in the open, putting roads in, putting houses and subdivisions, really fragments its habitat and causes this bird to be stuck in smaller and smaller habitat, remaining habitat, which is a real threat for the species. So I'm going to play its call, and you've probably heard this call, and if you haven't, you can't unhear it when you're now walking around California. It tends to sound like someone's dropping a ball, and then it's bouncing away. If you hear this bird, you're probably in chaparral habitat. Likewise, this one is a little bit more widely distributed, but the California thrasher is another common species in chaparral. It's endemic to California and Baja. It's related to the mockingbirds, and if you don't know much about birds, you've probably heard of a mockingbird. They get their name because they can mimic a lot of other different sounds and mock those sounds. And so they have really complex sounds. If you're not good at identifying bird calls, you become a herpetologist, because frogs only have one call for each species. But bird calls can be complex, and this is an example of a relatively complex call. So if I was out hiking in chaparral habitat, I would probably turn around and tell my friend, did you hear those 17 different bird species? And if they were a birder, they'd laugh at me. You can learn a lot about how a bird gets through life by how it looks, particularly its beak or its bill. That's going to tell you a lot about the kinds of things that it's eating. Also how sturdy and stout its legs are and its tail. This is a bird that will spend a lot of time hopping around on the ground, flipping things over, looking for grubs and other berries and things to eat. Both of them give us an opportunity to talk about convergent evolution. And convergent evolution, like the name sounds, converging, is when very unrelated, not closely related species end up looking very similar over time because they live in habitats that are very similar, and they occupy similar ecological niches, meaning they do similar things as a way of life. They may eat similar types of bugs, may eat similar types of berries, they may live on the ground, or they may be a high-flying bird. But because they do similar things in habitats that are roughly similar, they end up looking similar. So if we think about California, California has a Mediterranean climate. It's supposed to be wet in the winter. We're struggling with that this winter. We have dry summers, wet winters. It's called a Mediterranean climate because it was first described prominently in the Mediterranean region of North Africa and Southern Europe. But if you look around the globe, outside of California and the Mediterranean, we also have the very tip of South Africa. We have parts of Southern Australia, and then parts of South America that are all in this zone where we would have a Mediterranean climate. Hot, dry summers, mild, wet winters. As a result, those climatic forces shape the habitats. And we end up getting in 3 different parts of the world, 3 very similar habitats. More than that, but I'm showing you these 3. We're talking about the California chaparral. We also have the Chilean matorral, and then the coastal heath in Australia. And so the organisms that are living there are being shaped by similar plants. They're interacting with a similar climate. And so even though they are not closely related, we end up having 3 birds that occupy similar niches that fill similar roles and end up looking very similar. We were just talking about the California thrasher, for example. So all 3 of these are birds that spend a lot of time hopping around on the ground, using that bill, that beak, to dig around and flip things over and find berries, grubs, insects. We also talked about the wren tit. We have the canistero and the bristlebird, not closely related, but they end up looking very similar. They're relatively sedentary birds. They eat a lot of really tiny insects. Moving away from the bird world, we have things like the brush rabbit, which is, like many rabbits, relatively wary and secretive. Unlike many rabbits, this one will actually scurry up a tree when it's running away from you. Quite a different way to try and get away from predators. Coyotes don't climb very well, so they don't have to get very far to outrun a predator or to get away from a predator. We also have a subspecies, the riparian brush rabbit. Here in California, that is pretty endangered. I think it's down, I think it might be up to about 1,000 now. It's really prominent in Henry Caswell Memorial State Park. So if you ever go down there, you'll probably see this tiny little rabbit. It's just a subspecies that's endangered, that's only found in one little spot, but the other subspecies, the species itself, is distributed much more broadly. We have island foxes, which are endemic just to the Channel Islands of California, that are found off the coast of Santa Barbara, LA, and San Diego. So down here, they're found on the 6 largest of the Channel Islands. They're believed to be, we understand the working hypothesis with the most support is that they're closely related to mainland gray foxes, but they have undergone some substantial change in their genotype and phenotype as they have been separated on these islands away from the mainland of North America. As a result, they're really small compared to mainland foxes. They're about half the size. They get to be about 7 to 10 pounds, whereas the gray fox throughout North America gets quite a bit bigger, 20 to 30 pounds. They'll eat just about anything, and they are pretty bold. They're not shy because on those Channel Islands, they did not have to contend with any predators. They were the top dog, and they're not really afraid of people or anything else as a result. They are listed, they have been listed as a threatened or endangered species because their populations were declining pretty dramatically for a few reasons. People that live on some of these islands and have dogs had canine distemper and other diseases that got over into the foxes and killed a bunch. We also lost bald eagles on the Channel Islands beginning in the 1950s and 60s. And the bald eagles were replaced by golden eagles. A big distinction is bald eagles eat fish, golden eagles eat mammals. So the golden eagles started driving these declines in island foxes in the 90s as the golden eagles started to get more and more prevalent, started laying eggs and nesting on the Channel Islands. Again, largely because bald eagles had disappeared. I mentioned canine distemper virus, which also had a heavy toll on a lot of the island foxes. But there is great news in this story, and that is that they had been trapping and removing all of the golden eagles, taking them back over to the mainland, helping restore bald eagles on the Channel Islands. There are now 2 cameras that you can go look at live, one each on a different nest on the Channel Islands, where you can watch bald eagles having babies every year. So the bald eagles are recovering and doing really well. They're keeping the golden eagles away. They've also been doing a lot of captive breeding of island foxes and reintroducing and releasing them. And so their numbers are back up in the hundreds in most cases, and they're doing quite a bit better. Chaparral habitat being very prominent, being the major habitat in the Channel Islands. Another common critter from chaparral habitats is the pallid bat. Very widely distributed, so this is not just found in chaparral habitat. It's pretty common across the Great Basin Desert, the Mojave and Sonoran deserts, all the way up into the Pacific Northwest, but particularly in the drier sides of the northwestern U.S. And it's pretty different from a lot of other bats that we think of as having really tiny eyes and relying on echolocation radar, sonar, to find their prey. Pallid bats actually have pretty big eyes for a bat. And they have even bigger ears for a bat. So the question is, well, here's an example of another widely distributed one. Look how much bigger the eyes and ears are in the pallid bat. And the question is, why are their ears and eyes so much larger? And the answer is because they don't rely as much on echolocation. They actually rely on hearing their prey. They'll eat scorpions, tarantulas, other really big invertebrates, and they'll use those ears with their extreme sense of hearing, not for echolocation, but to actually hear their prey moving around on the forest floor or the chaparral floor. And then as they get closer, they'll rely on those eyes to see and fight with those scorpions. There's pretty extraordinary footage that several different nature companies have caught. You can go online and find it on YouTube or other places where you can watch pallid bats eat these scorpions, as many as 3 to 7 a night. Those scorpions, they'll put a hurting on you if they sting you, and they could probably kill the bat. So these bats have to know what they're doing and see what they're doing. Speaking of deadly venomous things, we'll get closer to my neck of the world and talk about a reptile. The western rattlesnake Not an endemic species, widely distributed across the western Pacific coast of North America. A handful of different subspecies shown here in different colors. Really common in chaparral habitat. How many of you have hiked around Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve that's open to the public west of Winters? Anybody? Wow, only 2 people? Okay, before you graduate, you got to do that. If you're early here and you got a few years, take advantage of the time and go do it. Great hiking. It's a pretty grueling hike. You want to do it before May. It gets pretty awful even in May when it's hot. It's about 6.5 miles. It's a 30-minute drive from here. Beautiful habitat. Much of it goes through chaparral, and every time I've gone across the ridge line, I've seen a rattlesnake crossing. Every time. All 3 times. Did I mention it's grueling and it gets really hot? It's worth doing, though. You get these incredible views down to the coast and also into the Central Valley because you're right on the coast range at a high point. But a pretty widely distributed venomous species of viper, the rattlesnake. And the western rattlesnake has a really interesting runaway coevolutionary interaction with ground squirrels, the California ground squirrel. Rattlesnakes eat a lot of mammals. They really like ground squirrels because they get big and it's a huge meal. Bigger, larger ground squirrels, especially down in San Diego, have developed resistance to the venom. They're immune to the venom of the western rattlesnake. So the western rattlesnake has been slowly evolving more and more toxic venom. So the ground squirrel has been developing more and more powerful immunity. So the rattlesnake's been developing more and more toxic, and it just runs away like that to the point now where if you step on one, I'll be at your funeral. Like, they're really bad. If you get bit by one up here, you're going to be fine. You're just going to wish you died because it hurts pretty bad. But the thing is, that immunity develops in these squirrels as they get larger. So mama will take shed skins back to her hole and she'll rub the skins all over the babies to try and disguise their smell from the rattlesnake. So it's a really interesting set of behaviors between these 2 species. Who doesn't love a horned lizard? People used to call them horned frogs or horned toads. If you live in Texas and you don't know how to read, you still call them the horned toads. But they're actually a lizard, not an amphibian. That's a joke about TCU, horned frogs. Most of y'all don't watch football, I get it. Horned lizards like this one, this is the coast horned lizard. Now we call it Blainville's horned lizard because there's a lot of different lizards that live on the coast. Only found in California, and this is an old range map. It's gone from most of this area. It only occurs in about 30% of its historic range. And so I could even update this. It's less than 45% now. It took me, I've been in California for about 14 years, and I only just saw my first one in September. And I've looked for them everywhere up here. I finally went down to Monterey and found some. They only eat ants. It's like over 90% of their diet. So they've lost a ton of habitat. That's where we live, has displaced these animals. And we also have non-native ants that have been killing off our native ants. And the non-native ants are not as big, they're not as nutritious. They don't really allow the horned lizard to survive and do well. They have a really cool couple of strategies. The first one is, like many reptiles, like many amphibians, they rely on just not being seen. They rely on crypsis. So you'll walk right past them. Most of the time, they'll sprint when you get too close, and that's actually how you find them, is you almost step on them, they run 3 feet, and then they quit moving, and you hope that you saw where they went, because you will not see them. They blend in so well. If that doesn't work, they can actually squirt blood from their eyes. And we actually know now that they do that almost exclusively in response to canines. So coyotes, foxes, kit foxes, gray foxes, red foxes, island foxes, all the foxes, or dogs, people's dogs. When they do that, and they squirt that blood on canid predators, so it doesn't work on bobcats, doesn't work on house cats, probably doesn't work on mountain lions, but there's something about the chemicals that are in their blood, probably sequestered from eating these ants that produce venom, that when it gets on a dog, the dogs react really strongly. They like they whine and scream and run away. And here's a video of it. But I can't stand the audio, so I'll just keep it muted. It's got like really corny music. So if you're a lizard, you're in heaven. This is like their buffet. They just hang out and fill up on these harvester ants and other ants. But here comes a coyote looking for a meal. And it starts messing with the horned lizard. The horned lizard is no longer able to rely on not being seen because the coyote has found it. I don't know how the lizard knows it's a canid and not a felid, not a cat of some kind. But they will increase the arterial pressure in the blood vessels around their eye. It will squirt that blood as much as 3 to 5 feet. When it gets on the coyote freaks out. The coyote's like, no thanks, I'm good. That tasted awful. It bothered my eyes or my nose or something. I tried to give my dog a spicy pecan nut yesterday, and he had the same reaction. So there's probably compounds that dogs just react really strongly to. Here's another example of convergent evolution. We mentioned both of these habitats, the Australian heath and the California chaparral. Well, we have the coast horned lizard, and this is a very distantly related family of lizards. So, tens of millions of years, if not 60 million years, they've been split, and yet they both eat small ants. They both move relatively slowly. They both have these jagged edges and rely on crypsis not to be seen. The thorny devil cannot squirt blood from its eyes. But we have convergent evolution in the way they look because of the circumstances in which we find them. Back to our chaparral. We have slender salamanders are really abundant and widespread in chaparral habitat. They are a pretty old lineage of salamanders. And you want to talk about sedentary, these are the epitome of a college kid. They won't get off the couch their entire lives if they have that option. Most of them will spend their lives under a chunk of wood, not moving very far at all, unless you mess with them. And if they're on a hillside, they'll coil up really tightly, and then they'll uncoil, and that'll cause them to bounce down a hill to get away from predators, like snakes and birds and mammals that may eat these things. These are a California specialty. There are a couple of species that make it outside of the state, but there are between 17 to 23 total species, and all but 2 are found only in California. So they don't move much, and they dry out and die quick if they're not staying moist, which means anytime they make it to some desert oasis, anytime over geologic time, over tens of thousands of years or 1 million years, when they make it to these tiny little oases that then start to dry out because climate is always changing a little bit, they're stuck there. And their genes will slowly be isolated, and they'll be only interacting with the other ones that are stuck there. And you'll have genetic drift, and you'll have some very low level of mutation. And over time, they'll end up looking really different from one another, or they may look similar, but their genes are incredibly different, more different than other species from one to another. So the result is that they are really patchily distributed in just these random moist spots, even down in the desert. And that gives rise, I'm only showing you a handful here, but that gives rise to about 20 different species, all within this complex, all part of the genus Batrachoceps. And in most cases, they have this similar body shape. They're relatively small, and they're really elongated. They have these really long tails. They look like a gummy worm. Part of the reason they are able to colonize these dry areas, like these desert oases or these mountaintops that don't get a lot of rain, is because they reproduce without water. They also breathe without lungs. How cool is that, right? Not a lot of vertebrates can get away with breathing without lungs. Well, the fish can do it, but not a lot of tetrapods can do it. But they can breed without water. They will lay their eggs in these moist areas. This is under a log that someone has flipped over. You can see it's a little bit moist. And instead of having larvae that swim in water like tadpoles do, their little larvae will stay in the egg and undergo metamorphosis inside the egg. And so when they finally hatch from the egg after 2 or 3 months, they look like a tiny version of the adult. They're about the size of the foreleg right here, but they have everything they need to look just like the adult, but a tiny version. And then they'll slowly grow and get big enough to be reproductive themselves. So you may notice, these are slender salamanders. This one looks very different. This is a different species of salamander that also has no lungs and also lays its eggs without water, like this slender salamander. This one is called the Insatina. This is a really bizarre example of a tetrapod, a four-legged vertebrate, that is both a species and a set of subspecies and maybe different species, but not really. We recognize 7 subspecies in California, and they all have these shaded regions show you the different patches where they're distributed. Not a lot of overlap from one patch to another, except right where patches were touching each other. And this is an example not of convergent evolution, where unrelated species look similar. This is divergent evolution, where one species starts to go in different directions. So it's the accumulation of differences between groups within a species that is slowly leading to speciation. And here's an example of their distributions, as well as how much variation there is in color. In the case of the Insatina, we actually call it a ring species. And it gets its name ring because it's found in around a ring of mountains around the Central Valley. So this was a species that when it was a lot hotter and drier, it was confined to the Pacific Northwest. As it started to get cooler and wetter, the species was moving southward. All of this was a great oceanic bay. The Central Valley was all seawater. And so it started moving around the mountains that were above water and moving southward, accumulating changes in its coloration, its genotype, its phenotype as it went. The oceans receded. This became the Central Valley. They were able to reconnect in the southern part near the transverse range. And now we're in a circumstance where every place along the coast range and every place along the Sierra, these individuals can breed with one another. But you get all the way down here and you can find this animal under a log with this animal and no evidence that they can breed. There's no gene flow between them. It looks like they have lost the ability to breed with one another. We would call those different species under such a circumstance. But are they a different species if they can breed with all these others all the way around the ring? It's not really clear. To my knowledge, this is the only vertebrate out of 70,000 vertebrates on the planet, 80,000 that we've identified, that can do this. And there's one invertebrate, I think a snail, that's been called a ring species. So it's where neighboring populations can interbreed, but there is an end population, 2 end populations that cannot interbreed. So they're neither subspecies or separate species. They're kind of a bit of both. And that, the name ring species gets its name because as you go around the ring, they can all interbreed until you get back to where you started, in this case down here, and they can no longer interbreed with one another. A little bit about some of the conservation challenges that we have in chaparral and coastal sage scrub habitat. One of the things I keep mentioning is habitat loss, fragmentation. There are many species, including birds like that tiny little wren tit, but certainly things like the slender salamanders that won't cross an open space that's just 3 to 6 feet wide. Maybe that's too much for them. They're too exposed. They're worried about getting eaten because they probably will get eaten. And so this could represent a fragmented habitat for many species. Now think about the 405. Right? Or a housing subdivision separating habitat, what kind of fragmentation that would cause. So the term habitat fragmentation is describing the origin, the emergence of breaks in the preferred habitat, discontinuities in their preferred habitat, chaparral in this case. So the habitats that were once continuous end up getting divided into separate fragments that are usually smaller and distantly placed to one another. So this is San Diego, and if I circle the chaparral habitat with a red, you can see that there are some big patches, there are tiny little patches, and they're all separated by highways, interstates, and housing subdivisions. We have a whole science in conservation biology that helps us understand the outcomes of fragmentation. It's called island biogeography. And the idea is that a larger patch can support more species than a smaller patch. That should just be intuitive. If you have more habitat, you can have more species or more individuals living there. If you have a really tiny one, you have fewer individuals, fewer species occurring there. But it also explains how if those patches are really close to another patch, there may be some ability for organisms to move in and out so that that smaller patch isn't having a lot of extinctions. But if that patch is really far away, it may be breaking the flow of individuals between these areas, and it means that when they go extinct here, you don't have new ones showing up. So if it's really far away or if it's really small, you support fewer species and fewer individuals. We've all seen the news. I've had a few of my students who have lost their homes in the LA fires, and if that's happened to you, I'm so sorry to hear about what's going on. This is a recurring problem and theme in California. It's made so much worse by how hot and dry it has gotten. It's made so much worse by how windy it has become because of how hot and dry it is. And it's made so much worse because of the choices we make about where we place our homes and how we manage our ecosystems. Chaparral habitat is a fire-adapted habitat. If you take people out of the landscape, it's going to burn every 7 or 8 years anyway. But it's going to be a much lower intensity thing. Those plants are designed, evolved over time to emerge. Their seeds in some cases don't even germinate unless the capsules are burst by heat. Low intensity heat, the kind of cycle of fire and process that used to take place all the time. Some of which was influenced by indigenous Americans, but a lot of which just happened as part of our natural system. Over time, we have been suppressing fire because nobody wants to be sucking down smoke and breathing that stuff. We have to have livable communities. We don't want to live right next to a low-intensity fire. But if we squash all these low-intensity fires and prevent them, if we make climate change worse, and if we build right next to them, then those fires are no longer low intensity. They are incredibly high intensity. They move fast and they burn homes, and we lose lives and property. And that is unfortunately exactly what is happening. These are photos, you could take these any 2 or 3 years. Davis has had a pretty rough go of it. We were sucking on smoke in fall of 2018, a little bit in 2019, and then awful during the peak of the pandemic in August and September of 2020. I was stuck at home alone with a 6-year-old, just me and him. Couldn't see anyone because of COVID, and then we couldn't even go outside for 8 weeks because the fire and smoke was so bad, even here, where we don't seem to have fire right at our doorstep. And this is, of course, San Diego, up into LA, Santa Monica Mountains. This is right near where the Eaton fire is, and this was 7 or 8 years ago. So this cycle is perpetual, but now these fires have gotten worse and worse. We are building a lot. This is all the growth patterns, exurban growth population trends around Sacramento. You can see a lot of that growth in the Coast Range and in the foothills of the Sierra. It's not just the Central Valley where we have agriculture, but it's right in the midst of all of this chaparral habitat and right where we have all of these endemic species. That creates a lot of real risk and challenge for threatened and endangered species. And it likely means that if you go into a career working in wildlife, you're probably going to stay gainfully employed for the rest of your life because we're going to have a lot of problems to solve environmentally and with our natural and native species management here in California. That's it for me for today. Thank you all.